I will now present an extremely shortened version of recent U.S. monetary history. The purpose of this section is to show you that in the past the U.S. government has radically shifted the rules during times of emergency, and that our monetary system is really a lot younger than you might think. After the Great Financial Panic of 1907, when private banker J.P. Morgan stepped in as the lender of last resort, banks began agitating for a government solution. What was finally decided upon in 1913 was a federally sponsored cartel called the Federal Reserve, which sounded governmental but really was not. The stock of the Federal Reserve was to be held by its privately owned member banks, not the U.S. government nor the public, which remains the case today. So what we call the Federal Reserve is actually a federally sponsored banking cartel, licensed to lend money into existence. One of the main arguments for creating the Federal Reserve was to have a central bank able to step in and prevent losses from panics. How did that work out? Not very well. Instead of simply being a lender of last resort, the Federal Reserve had helped provide the necessary fuel for a speculative bubble in stocks that burst in 1929 with devastating effect. Among the financial consequences were numerous bank failures, a money supply that shrank by nearly a third in just 3 years, and in 1933, the U.S. government effectively declaring bankruptcy. At that time, newly elected President Franklin D. Roosevelt decided to counter the falling money supply in a most drastic manner. He ordered the confiscation of all privately held gold and immediately devalued the U.S. dollar. Up until this time in history, America was on the gold standard, which meant that each paper dollar in circulation was backed by a specific amount of gold, which the paper dollars could be exchanged for upon demand. Prior to the gold seizure, it took approximately $21 to buy an ounce of gold, and afterwards it took $35. And soon after that, contractual obligations of the United States government, such as bonds payable in gold, were nullified with the approval of the Supreme Court. This just goes to show how governments, in a period of emergency, can and will change rules and even break their own laws, even if those laws are written into the Constitution. All of the seized gold either ended up in the vaults of the Federal Reserve, at the International Monetary Fund, or on the books of the Federal Reserve. A grand total of $11 billion was exchanged for all 261 million ounces of the nation's gold. In other words, complete control of the gold supply of the most powerful and prosperous nation on earth was exchanged for slightly more than $11 billion, literally printed out of thin air. After just 20 years of existence, a private banking cartel went from an idea to owning all of the wealth of a young and prosperous nation. Not bad. Every one of these original 261 million ounces of gold still remain on the books of the Federal Reserve as an asset, so technically it actually belongs to the shareholders of that corporation, not the American people. In any event, to end the turmoil of depression and a subsequent world war, and to provide a foundation for global recovery, a conference was held at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, with all the major Allied powers attending, with the goal of settling on a world monetary system. Recognizing that the U.S. then represented nearly half of the global economy, the U.S. dollar was made the global reserve currency. All other currencies had fixed rates of exchange to the dollar, which in turn was redeemable for gold at $35 per ounce. The Bretton Woods system ushered in a period of prosperity and rapid economic recovery, but there was a flaw in the system. Nothing in the Bretton Woods Agreement prevented the U.S. from expanding the supply of Federal Reserve notes, or dollars, as rapidly as it wished. And this happened, and as it did, the gold backing behind each dollar in circulation steadily declined, such that there was not enough gold to back all of the dollars. Meanwhile, as the Vietnam War intensified, the U.S. was running budget deficits and flooding the world with paper dollars. The French, under President Charles de Gaulle, became suspicious that the U.S. would be unable to honor its Bretton Woods obligations to redeem their excess dollars into gold. As the French worriedly exchanged their surplus dollars into gold, the U.S. Treasury's gold stocks declined alarmingly. Finally, President Nixon declared force majeure on August 15, 1971, and slammed the gold window, ending the dollar's convertibility into gold. The last ties of the U.S. dollar to gold were severed. The days of a gold standard were now over. Well, that's what governments do during wartime and during crises. They change the rules to allow them to print what they need rather than impose unpopular taxes, trusting that it will all somehow get paid back at some point in the future. And the U.S. followed that pattern to a T. However, this time it affected the whole world because the removal of gold convertibility of the dollar destroyed the foundation of the Bretton Woods system. Without a gold backing, there was no hard physical limit to how many paper dollars could be issued. Since we now know that all dollars are backed by debt, What do you suppose happened to U.S. debt levels once the externally applied rigor of a gold standard was removed? Let's find out. This is a chart of U.S. federal debt from the period between 1949 and 2013. Note that it looks just like any other exponential chart we've already viewed. But especially note what happens after Nixon slams the gold window. That is, when Nixon removed the last vestige of external physical restraint from this system. And also note how rapidly the debt levels have climbed recently. These past few years have seen the highest and most rapid accumulation of federal debt in our entire history, thanks in large measure to a series of experiments never before attempted in our country's history. The conduct of 2 foreign wars and a tax cut at the same time while the Federal Reserve was printing money out of thin air to finance enormous structural deficits at the federal level. This rapid accumulation of debt is not a mysterious process at all. Rather, it is an entirely predictable consequence of the slamming of the gold window. Remove constraints from politicians, and they will spend. As far as I know, that's happened in every country that's tried it. Now, how much longer can this continue? Unfortunately, there's no good answer to that besides, as long as foreigners let us. A second predictable and related consequence concerns the total amount of money in circulation. Remember, all money is loaned into existence, so the shape of the federal debt chart should tip you off to the shape of this next chart of money. This chart is of U.S. money from the years 1959 to 2013. The first thing we can note here is that it took our country over 300 years, from the very first pilgrim until 1973, to generate our first $1 trillion of money stock. Every road, every bridge, every marketplace, on every corner of every town and city, every boat and every building from the very first colony until 350 years later required just $1 trillion of money stock to accomplish. Now, we're creating $1 trillion in just under a year. My question to you is, what will it be like to live here when our nation is creating $1 trillion every 6 months? How about every 6 weeks? What about every 6 hours? 6 minutes? Where does this stop, if not in hyperinflation and the destruction of the dollar and, by extension, our national prosperity? If we view all of these events on a timeline, we can see that the Federal Reserve was formed in 1913, and only 20 years later, in 1933, the United States had entered a form of bankruptcy during which it turned over its collective gold supply under force of law to the Federal Reserve. 11 years after that, the U.S. dollar was enshrined as the world's reserve currency, with an explicit backing by gold. That system was then ended by Nixon 27 years later. In effect, the current global monetary system of unbacked, free-floating currencies is now roughly 40 years old. It was not planned, but simply emerged out of a crisis. The unredeemable U.S. dollar remains a popular reserve currency as a matter of convenience, but nothing requires or guarantees that it will retain this role. It's a safe bet that the next currency system will arise out of some future crisis, too. Only the U.S. is able to use its eroding reserve currency status to borrow and print dollars to pay for its trade deficits and fiscal deficits. However, should this abuse create doubts about the dollar's integrity as a sound reserve currency, the U.S. will be forced to either export more to pay for imports or to take on ever heavier levels of debt. If these actions cause the dollar to keep falling, other countries will then be tempted to devalue their currencies to keep pace and remain competitive. In fact, we've already seen such currency wars erupt among the major fiat currency issuers of the world. The U.S. Fed, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, all have dramatically increased their sovereign money supplies over the past few years, and no end to the money printing is yet in sight. Every government wants the same thing: as much money as it desires to spend without resorting to increased taxes, and a weak currency to keep their exporting businesses happy. These money printing efforts go by a variety of fancy names such as quantitative easing or QE. And knowing how these work actually will help you understand why they are really traps that are very hard to get out of once begun. At least, they are without a lot of painful disruptions.